The first thing the galaxy ever learned about war was simple: the side with more ships wins. The Verk Coalition had built their entire civilization around that truth. 12 species, 700 years of expansion, and not a single world they had aimed at had ever pushed back hard enough to matter. They did not conquer through cruelty alone. They conquered through math. If you put enough steel in someone's sky, the equations became very clear, very fast. The target either surrendered or it burned. Those were the only two options the Coalition had ever needed. Grand Warlord Verk stood at the command window of his flagship and looked at the star ahead of him. It was a quiet, yellow sun, ordinary, the kind of star that existed in 1,000 other systems across the galaxy. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual. Nothing about the blue-green planet orbiting it, third rock from that unremarkable sun, suggested a species worth worrying about. And yet, Verk had read every intelligence report his analysts had compiled on this place. The humans, 200 years of space travel, no galactic wars on record, a species that had spent most of its history fighting itself, carving its own home world into bleeding pieces over borders and beliefs and things that made very little sense from the outside. Primitive by any honest measure, loud by any measure at all. And yet 3 Coalition scout ships had vanished in this system over the last decade. No debris, no signals, no explanation, just silence where there had once been a crew. Verk had filed that detail and moved on. Scout ships were lost. It happened. Behind him, spread across the space of an entire solar approach corridor, 4,700 Coalition warships moved in formation. Cruisers the size of cities, destroyers in long silver rows, carriers with entire armies folded inside their hulls. It was the largest single fleet the Coalition had ever assembled, not because the humans required it, but because Verk wanted the message to be unmistakable. He wanted it to arrive before his ships did, carried on the light of their engines, felt in the bones of every living thing on that blue world long before a single weapon was charged. Subcommander Oreth moved to stand beside him. Oreth was careful where Verk was bold. He ran numbers where Verk trusted his instincts. That balance had kept them both alive through 6 prior campaigns. "Scans complete," Oreth said. He held a data slate in both hands. He did not offer it immediately, which was unusual. "And," Verk said. Oreth set the slate on the console between them. "Their orbital defenses are minimal. 12 patrol vessels in standard rotation, a handful of surface-based systems, nothing we would classify as a prepared fleet." Verk looked at the numbers. They matched what he had expected. The humans had no navy worth the name. "Then we proceed on schedule." "Yes," Oreth said. He paused. "There is one anomaly." "One. Our long-range sensors are picking up a slight gravitational irregularity near the debris field of their largest moon's shattered fragment. Could be geological, could be something in the rock." He paused again. "Could be nothing." Verk looked at the scan results. A faint smudge of a reading, barely worth the ink. "Flag it and move on." Oreth nodded. He did not look entirely satisfied, but he did not push. That too was part of their balance. Aboard the ISV Resolute, Captain Rian Adler had not slept in 31 hours. He sat in the secondary observation chair on the command deck, one level below where Admiral Dara Osai stood at the main console, and he watched the Coalition fleet materialize on every screen the ship had. One by one, then in groups, then in waves, until the solar approach corridor looked less like space and more like the inside of something closing. He counted them for a while. He stopped at 300 because the number stopped meaning anything useful around 300. 4,700 ships. He had known it was coming. He had been briefed, drilled, told the exact projected arrival count down to the nearest 100. Knowing a number and watching it happen in real space, with real light bouncing off real hulls, were very different experiences. His hands were resting on his knees and he made himself keep them still. "You're counting," Admiral Dara said, without turning from her console. "Trying to," Rian said. "Don't, it won't help you." He looked at her back. She was perfectly still. She had been perfectly still for the better part of an hour. Not the stillness of calm, exactly. More the stillness of someone who had decided, long before this moment arrived, exactly what they were going to do and had nothing left to decide. Admiral Dara Osai had been planning for this day for 15 years. Rian had only come aboard the Resolute 8 months ago. He sometimes felt the gap between those two facts like a physical thing. "Are we going to charge weapons?" he asked. "No." "Are we going to raise shields?" "Not yet." "Are we going to?" "Captain," she said it gently, "I need you to stop asking what we are going to do and start watching what they are going to do. That is your job right now." He closed his mouth. He watched the screens. The Coalition fleet advanced in beautiful, terrible formation. They moved like something that had done this many times before because they had. Their approach vectors were clean. Their spacing was precise. There was no hesitation in any of it, no searching for a threat that needed addressing. They moved the way a person crosses an empty room, quickly and without thinking about their feet. They had not seen the Resolute yet. The ship sat in total darkness inside the debris field, engines cold, every emission suppressed, every reflective surface angled away from Coalition sensor bands. Months of preparation had gone into this concealment. Months of choosing the right debris, positioning the right rocks, calibrating the suppression systems to the exact frequencies the Coalition used for their long-range arrays. The fleet moved closer and closer, until Rian could see individual hull markings on the nearest cruisers without magnification. "Now," Dara said quietly. She reached forward and pressed a single control. The Resolute's running lights came on. Not its weapons, not its shields, not its engines, just the lights. The same quiet amber and white running lights that any vessel in open space used to announce its presence to traffic. One ship, sitting between 4,700 warships and the planet they had come to take. On every Coalition vessel in the approach corridor, automatic targeting systems locked onto the Resolute within 4 seconds. The sensor returns flooded back to Verk's flagship before anyone had a chance to process what they were seeing. Verk stared at the image on his main viewer. One human ship. Not a fleet, not a formation, not even a defensive screen. One ship sitting quietly in space with its lights on, as if it had simply been waiting for them to arrive. He opened his mouth to give the fire order. He did not give it. He was not sure why later when he tried to reconstruct the moment. The targeting solutions were clean. The range was good. The Resolute was a single vessel against his entire armada, and the math was beyond obvious. He had every reason to fire and no tactical reason to hesitate. But something in the way the ship sat there stopped him. Not moving, not charging weapons, not running, just waiting, like it knew something he did not, like it had been expecting him specifically. Orath's voice was very quiet beside him. "Sir, their ship. Our instruments can't classify it." Verk looked at the sensor readout. The energy signature coming off the Resolute didn't match any known human configuration. It wasn't powering weapons. It wasn't doing anything recognizable. It was doing something their instruments had no category for. The fleet held its fire. The Resolute held its position. And in the space between them, in the silence that stretched across 4,700 ships and one, something shifted. The math that had always been simple for the Coalition began, for the first time in 7 centuries, to feel uncertain. Verk stared at the ship. The ship did not stare back. It had no need to. It simply waited, quiet as a held breath, patient as a thing that already knew how the story ended. Silence in space costs nothing. It weighs nothing. It takes up no room. But in the right circumstances, silence can do the work of an entire army, and the coalition fleet had not yet learned that lesson. 7 minutes passed after the Resolute lit its running lights. 7 minutes where 4,700 warships held their fire and their formation, and said absolutely nothing on any open channel. Fleet commanders sent tight beam queries to Verk's flagship. Verk did not answer them. He was staring at the sensor readout with the particular focus of a man who had built his entire career on reading tactical situations quickly, and who was now reading one that refused to make sense. The Resolute had not moved. It had not powered anything recognizable. It sat in space like a stone dropped in the middle of a road, small and completely unconcerned about what was coming toward it. Oreth pulled up the human intelligence files on the secondary console and began going through them again. He had read them twice before the fleet arrived. He read them with different eyes now. Humans, a species that had been killing each other in wars for 10,000 years before they ever built a spacecraft. A species that had looked at their own moon and decided to stand on it within 60 years of discovering flight. A species that had survived ice ages, plagues, the collapse of civilizations, and the invention of weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, and had come out the other side still standing, still building, still moving forward. He had read all of that before and filed it under biological resilience. Most young species were resilient in one way or another. It was not remarkable on its own. What he read now, looking for something he had missed the first 2 times, was a footnote buried in the section on human military history. It was a quote from an old human strategist, someone who had lived centuries before their species ever left their home world. The quote had been included in the file as cultural context, the kind of thing analysts added to round out a profile. Oreth read it slowly. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. He set the file down. He looked at the Resolute on the viewer. That ship knew them. He felt it with a certainty that had no clean tactical basis. He could not put numbers to it. He could not write it in a report. But something in the way the vessel sat there, without panic, without aggression, without any of the signals a cornered animal gives off, told him that whoever was on that ship had been watching the coalition for a very long time. Aboard the Resolute, Dr. Priya Nath was running diagnostics on all 17 weapons systems for the 3rd time in 2 hours, not because she expected to find a fault, because her hands needed something to do. She sat in the weapons bay, 3 decks below the command level, surrounded by screens showing readout after readout of systems that were all performing exactly as designed. The Resolute was in perfect health, every system nominal, every backup online, every failsafe armed and waiting. She had spent 22 years designing those systems, longer than some of her junior crew had been alive. Rian came down to find her during the long, quiet stretch after the fleet had stopped advancing. He pulled up a stool and sat across from her without asking permission, which told her he was rattled enough not to think about small formalities. "How many of them could we take?" he asked. Priya looked at him over her screens. "All of them," she said. He blinked. "You're serious." "I'm always serious." She pulled up a schematic on the screen between them and turned it so he could see. "Not quickly, not without cost, but yes, if we had to." She paused. "That's not the plan." "I know that's not the plan. I just wanted to know if it was possible." "Possibility and plan are 2 very different things, Captain." She turned the screen back. "The Admiral didn't build this ship to start fights." Rian was quiet for a moment. He looked around the weapons bay at the scale of the systems lining the walls, the arrays that had no equivalent in any known alien navy. "She built it to end them," he said. Priya did not answer that. She went back to her diagnostics. On the flagship, Verk finally answered the queries from his fleet commanders. He told them to hold position and maintain weapons lock. He did not tell them why. He was not entirely sure of the answer himself. He sent the standard Coalition conquest transmission to the Resolute. Every species they had ever encountered had a version of this moment. The message was clear, reasonable on its surface, and carried the full mathematical weight of 4,700 warships behind every word. Surrender, accept Coalition authority. The population would be classified, cataloged, and preserved. Their world would be administered. Their resources would be allocated. They would become part of something larger. That was the offer. He had sent this message to 40 worlds across his career. 38 had accepted immediately. 2 had not, and neither of those worlds existed anymore in a form anyone would recognize. He sent the message and waited. The Resolute received it. He could confirm reception from the electromagnetic return. And then nothing happened. No response, no acknowledgement, no counteroffer, no refusal, no delay request. The channel simply sat open on the human end, receiving and returned nothing. Oreth leaned close. "They're not going to answer," he said quietly. "Everyone answers," Verk said. The scout ships didn't. Verk's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Counselor Bish appeared at the edge of the command deck. He was a small figure from one of the Coalition's newer member species, with pale gray skin and large eyes that held more expression than most species could manage with their entire faces. He had voted against this campaign in the Coalition Council. He had been the only one who did. He had been brought on the flagship as a formality, a gesture toward democratic process that no one had seriously intended to honor. "Has any species," Bish said, in his careful, formal way, "ever simply not responded to your demand?" Verk looked at him. "No." Bish nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That is interesting," he said, and returned to the edge of the deck. Verk grew impatient. He ordered 3 destroyers out of formation to strike a nearby asteroid. Show of force. The Coalition had used this technique before, an unambiguous demonstration of what the weapons could do, aimed at rock instead of flesh, giving the target population time to watch their own future and reconsider their silence. The destroyers fired. The asteroid came apart in a clean, brilliant flash. The debris field spread in a perfect sphere. It was, by any objective standard, extremely impressive. On his viewer, Verk watched the Resolute. It had not moved. It had not flinched. It had not changed its sensor profile in any detectable way. Then, from the Resolute, one tight beam transmission arrived on the Coalition's standard frequencies. Not a voice, not a video signal, just text, translated automatically by the Coalition's universal communication systems. 2 words. Noted. And then Arm System 7. Verk stared at those words. The second line was not addressed to the Coalition. It was an internal communication that the Resolute had, very deliberately, not bothered to encrypt. They wanted him to read it. Before he could process that, the Resolute began to change. Not a weapons charge, not a shield raise. The hull itself was moving, panels sliding. New arrays extending from compartments that had not existed in their scan data 2 minutes ago. The ship was physically reconfiguring, like a living thing rearranging its own skeleton, and when it was done, it looked almost nothing like the vessel their targeting systems had been locked onto. Every targeting solution across every Coalition ship in the fleet became obsolete in under 90 seconds. The fleet's weapons were still charged. They were locked onto where the Resolute had been, not what it was now, and updating those solutions would require rescanning a ship that was no longer sitting still. Verk's hand moved toward the fire command on his console. He did not press it. Oreth said nothing beside him. Oreth had stopped talking, which was the thing that worried Verk more than anything else happening on those screens. The Resolute finished its reconfiguration. New arrays fully extended, new profile established, and then, like before, it simply stopped moving and sat there. Waiting. Patient. Certain. Outside Verk's flagship, 4,700 warships held their positions and said nothing. The silence had returned, but it was heavier now. It pressed on the inside of the hull like something with actual weight. Orath finally spoke very quietly. "Sir, if that ship can do that to its hull in 90 seconds, he stopped. What else can it do?" Verk had no answer. For the first time in 30 years of campaign command, Grand Warlord Verk looked at an enemy vessel and had no answer. That was new. That was very new. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a racing heart or cold sweat. It arrives as a question, and the question feels small at first, barely worth noticing, something that could be dismissed and explained away. And then the question is still there an hour later, and it is not small anymore. Orath had that question now. He had stepped away from Verk's side after the hull reconfiguration. He needed space to think, which meant he needed to be somewhere Verk was not watching him think, because Verk had a way of reading doubt on people's faces and reacting badly to it. Orath stood in a side corridor off the command deck, looking at his data slate, working through the numbers one more time. He pulled up every known scan of a human vessel. There were 43 on record: patrol ships, research vessels, one small military cruiser that had been photographed at long range near their outer colonies. Orath looked at each one in sequence. He understood all of them. They were young civilization ships, competent enough, recognizable in their basic structure. Engines here, weapons there. Crew sections distributed along the middle sections. Standard architecture for a species that had been building spacecraft for 200 years. Then he looked at the Resolute. It did not belong in the same category as those other 43 ships. It did not belong in any category his instruments had a file for. He was not a man who used the word impossible, because in his experience, impossible was usually just a label for things that had not happened yet. But standing in that corridor, looking at the Resolute scan profile, he found himself borrowing the word on credit and promising to return it later. He went back to the 3 missing scout ships. He had a new theory. It was not a comfortable one. Priya was thinking about Jupiter. She did that sometimes during long waits. Went back to the beginning in her mind, walked through the whole thing from the start, the way you check a structure by going back to the foundation. 22 years ago, the unified Earth government had brought together 47 of the best engineers, physicists, and weapons scientists alive. They had not advertised the gathering. They had not written about it. They had done it quietly, behind the cover of a publicly announced deep space telescope array project, which was a real project that also happened to provide excellent cover for the movement of materials, personnel, and very large amounts of specialized equipment to the orbital construction yards behind Jupiter. The project had a name. The name was classified to a level so high that most of the people involved never knew what level it was. The directive behind it was simple. It had been written by a historian, not a general, which was perhaps why it said what it said so plainly. The directive read, "We will not be caught unprepared. Whatever comes from wherever it comes, we will have something waiting. We are building it now." Priya had been 29 when she was recruited. She had spent the previous 5 years designing naval railgun systems, which felt very small by the end of the first week at Jupiter. The scope of what they were attempting was larger than anything she had thought about before, not in terms of size, though the Resolute was very large, but in terms of intention. They were not building a warship. They were building an argument. A physical, steel-end energy argument that said to the universe, "We know you are out there, and we have been thinking about you for a very long time." She thought about that directive now, in the weapons bay, with 4,700 enemy ships sitting in the dark outside the hull. She also thought about what the Resolute could actually do, and she felt the same thing she always felt when she thought about it clearly, a mixture of pride and something that sat close to horror, and she had never quite managed to separate the two. Rian went back to the command deck. He needed to be there, needed to be doing his job rather than sitting with Priya in the weapons bay letting his imagination produce worse numbers than reality. Dara was at her console. She had been at her console for so long that Rian was fairly sure she had not eaten anything since before the fleet arrived. He thought about mentioning it and decided not to. "The outer ring," she said without looking up. "Bring it online, passive only. No targeting solutions, just power." Rian relayed the order. 3 minutes later, the Resolute's passive sensors picked up the return. Far out in the solar system, beyond the orbit of the outermost planet, things were waking up. Large things. Structures that had been sitting cold and dark and completely invisible for 2 years, since the last maintenance crew had locked them down and withdrawn. They powered up slowly, the way large systems do, and as they came online they began to appear on sensor readings that the Coalition fleet would pick up within minutes. Massive, that was the word. Enormously, impossibly massive, at ranges that put the entire Coalition armada well inside their theoretical engagement envelope. Dara had not invented the outer ring. It was not a weapons system in the traditional sense. It was closer to an argument made in metal. The structures had never been fired. No one knew for certain if they would ever need to be. But they existed, and they were real, and they were now drawing power. On the flagship, the emergency sensor alert came through on every screen at once. Orath saw it before Verk did. He read the numbers twice. He cross-checked them against the system survey data from their approach. The outer ring structures had not been in any survey. They had not been there, or if they had been invisible, cold, and undetectable, sitting out beyond the planets like sleeping things. Now they were awake. Now they were well within range of every ship in the Coalition fleet. Orath ran the numbers on their targeting envelopes. He ran them again. He brought in the fleet's 3 best tactical analysts to run them independently. All 3 came back with the same conclusion. If those structures were weapons, the Coalition fleet had entered their range approximately 90 minutes ago. They had been inside that range, without knowing it, since before the Resolute had even turned on its lights. The Coalition Council erupted. The tight beam channels between ships flooded with traffic. 3 of the 12 species representatives began formally requesting emergency session rights under the Coalition Charter. Fleet commanders sent queries that were less queries and more increasingly panicked demands for information. What were those structures? How had they not appeared in the surveys? How large were they? Verk silenced the open channels. He muted the council feeds. He stood at his command window and looked at the Resolute, small and still in the distance, and something cold settled in his chest. The humans had not shown him the outer ring. The outer ring had simply turned on when the Resolute was ready, as if following a sequence, as if this entire situation was a plan that had already been written out from start to finish long before his fleet arrived. He thought about his 40 campaigns. He thought about every species that had faced his armada and the shapes their fear had taken. Some had run. Some had fought immediately. Most had sent increasingly desperate communications in the minutes before the end. He had a very good eye for what a cornered civilization looked like. The humans did not look like that. They looked like people who had been sitting in a room, waiting for a scheduled appointment to arrive. Bish was back on the command deck. Orath noticed him and noticed that Bish was not panicking. He was watching Verk with a calm, careful expression. "Grand Warlord," Bish said quietly, "I would like to note for the formal record that this outcome was foreseeable." Verk did not answer. Orath went back to his data slate. He opened a new file. He began writing. He wrote carefully, in plain language, without military decoration. He wrote what the tactical situation actually was, and what the numbers actually said, and what he believed the rational response to those numbers was. He titled the file, Withdrawal Assessment. He did not show it to Verk, not yet. He saved it, closed it, and looked up at the Resolute on the main viewer. The ship had not moved. It had not fired. It had not said another word. It just waited, out there in the dark, patient and terrible, like something that had all the time in the universe and knew it. Outside, in the deep cold of the outer system, the structures continued to warm up, slowly, unhurried, like they too had nowhere else to be. Pride is expensive. Most species can afford it during peacetime when the cost is mostly social. But in the middle of a military engagement, when pride is the thing steering decisions instead of sense, the invoice arrives fast, and it arrives large. Fleet Captain Durak of the Veth Armada contingent had built his career on the particular kind of pride that wore aggression as a uniform, and he had never yet encountered a situation that cost him enough to change his habits. He looked at the Resolute on his tactical screen. One ship, smaller than his own cruiser by a significant margin, sitting there with its running lights on like it was docked at a civilian port. He had listened to Verk's silence for over an hour. He had watched the fleet hold position while analysts argued about sensor readings and counselors demanded emergency meetings, and nobody did the one thing that was obviously correct. He opened a private channel to the 6 wing captains under his command. "We are going to answer the question," he said. 9 ships, attack formation. If their weapons are as impressive as the data claims, we will find out. If they are not, we will have solved the problem and the Grand Warlord can thank us later." Not one of his captains argued. That was the thing about pride. It was contagious among people who had already decided they were not afraid. The 9 ships broke formation. On the Resolute, the movement registered immediately. Rian saw the formation break on the tactical display and felt his stomach drop. 9 coalition ships, not the full fleet, 9 ships, pulling out of line and angling toward them in a spread formation. Attack configuration. He had studied enough coalition tactical doctrine to read the pattern. They were not going to fire warning shots. They were coming in to engage directly. "Admiral," he said. "I see them," Dara said. She had not moved. She was still at her console, one hand resting on the edge of it, completely still. 9 ships, attack formation. There'll be an optimal firing range in 4 minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Dara said. Their optimal range is shorter than the coalition standard. Veth cruisers use a different targeting architecture. She knew which ships they were by their formation. She knew their optimal firing range without looking it up. Rian looked at her. "Orders." Dara was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of hesitation, the quiet of someone choosing words with precision. "Let them come," she said. "Let them." "That is the order, Captain." Rian turned back to his console. He kept his hands flat on the surface. He watched the 9 ships close the distance. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He counted by looking at the tactical display and watching the range numbers drop. Priya's voice came over the internal channel from the weapons bay. "Gravity shear system is armed. Targeting solution for all 9 is confirmed." Dara said, "On my mark." The range dropped. The 9 ships were close enough now that their individual hull details were visible on the optical sensors without magnification. Durak's cruiser was in the lead, slightly ahead of the others, the way a fleet captain leads when he intends to make a statement. Rian's fingers found the edge of his console and gripped it. Dara said, "Mark." Nothing fired. That was the first thing Durak noticed because he had been braced for the light of weapons. He had watched for it, had his shields at full strength and his point defense system cycling, had done everything tactically correct. He had expected fire. Instead, his ship stopped. Not an impact, not a hit from anything he had a name for. It simply stopped moving as if space itself had thickened around his hull and refused to let him through. He felt no collision. His ship was not damaged. His systems were all online. His engines were firing at full burn. He was not moving. Neither were the 8 ships around him. All 9 vessels sat fixed in space, engines burning against nothing, held in place as if a hand had reached out of the dark and closed around each of them. Then Durak's ship began to turn. Slowly, without his helm doing anything. His helm officer was fighting the controls and reporting nothing in response. The ship turned on its axis as if it were being rotated by something outside. All 9 ships turned, and when they were done turning, they were all pointing back the way they had come. Back toward the Coalition fleet. Then whatever had been holding them released. The engines were still at full burn. All 9 ships shot forward toward the Coalition formation, and Durak had to cut power immediately and fight his own velocity to avoid slamming into the nearest Coalition cruiser. His ship scattered back into the mass of the fleet, disorganized, rattled, and completely unharmed. Not a single beam had been fired, not a single projectile. 9 warships had been grabbed, turned around, and sent home like children who had wandered somewhere they were not supposed to be. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rian had ever experienced. He realized, after several seconds, that he had been holding his breath and let it out. "That," said Dara, "is how we do it." Verk stripped Durak's rank on an open channel before the manned ship had even finished stabilizing. The stripping was brutal and public and entirely deserved from a military discipline standpoint, but it was a mistake. Open channel meant the Resolute systems were recording every word. And it meant the rest of the Coalition fleet heard a grand warlord publicly losing control of his own commanders, publicly demonstrating that his fleet had just been handled without violence by a single enemy vessel, publicly confirming that he did not, in fact, have a plan for what had just happened. Bish stood on the command deck and said nothing. His face said it for him. Oreth opened his withdrawal file. He added 2 paragraphs. He still did not show it to Verk. The Coalition Council could no longer be silenced. 4 species representatives were speaking simultaneously on the fleet-wide frequency, demanding answers, demanding a session, demanding that someone explain what a gravity shear field was, and how a vessel the size of the Resolute was projecting one large enough to hold 9 warships simultaneously. The Fleet Science Division had no explanation. They sent the data back to Coalition space for analysis. The analysts there would not have an explanation either. The technology did not exist in any database they held. Then the Resolute opened a channel. For the first time since the fleet had arrived, a human voice came through on the Coalition's standard frequencies. It was clear, it was calm, it was unhurried. It was a woman's voice. "We have completed our assessment of your fleet," the voice said. "You have 4,722 vessels in the current formation. Your command nodes are distributed across 14 flagship-class ships. Your primary power systems have 3 points of interdependence that, if interrupted simultaneously, would cascade across approximately 60% of your fleet. We have targeting solutions for all of this. We have had them for some time." A pause, not a dramatic pause, just the pause of someone who wanted to make sure what they had said had been fully absorbed. "We are not sharing this information as a threat. We are sharing it because we believe you are intelligent enough to find it more useful than a demonstration. You have seen one demonstration today. We would prefer not to do another." Another pause. "You are free to make whatever decision you believe is correct. We will wait." The channel closed. Verk stood absolutely still. Rian, watching from the command deck of the Resolute, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "How did you know they would not fire while you were talking?" Dara looked at him. "Because a species that fires while someone is speaking is a species that has already stopped thinking, and they have not stopped thinking yet." She turned back to her console. "That is the window we need." Oreth, on the flagship, read his withdrawal file again. He added a 3rd paragraph. His hand was very steady on the data slate, and his face was the face of a man who had done the math for the last time and arrived at the same answer for the 4th time in a row. The answer was the same every time. It had not changed with more data. It was not going to change. And somewhere in the outer system, the structures continued to warm up, patient and enormous and waiting for orders that had not been given yet and might never need to be. That last part was the point. That had always been the point. The Coalition Charter had a clause that nobody liked to read aloud at council sessions, because it was the kind of clause that existed to cover failures no one wanted to imagine. It required that all offensive military campaigns be maintained by unanimous agreement. If the agreement broke, the legal framework of the campaign broke with it. It was a clause that had been inserted by the smaller member species 800 years ago, when the coalition was still young enough to compromise, and it had never once been invoked because no campaign had ever reached the point where it needed to be. Until now. 4 species submitted formal withdrawal notices within 40 minutes of Admiral Dara's transmission. They did it simultaneously, which meant they had been coordinating in private while the fleet held position, which meant the coordination had started before the transmission, which meant they had been ready to leave for some time, and had been waiting for the moment to feel clean enough to do it. Verk could not legally stop them. He could strip ranks. He could make things uncomfortable. He could not hold species in an offensive campaign they had formally withdrawn from without dissolving the entire coalition structure, which would cost him far more politically than losing 4 minor members. He dismissed their withdrawal notices in the coldest possible language and moved on. But 4 species leaving was not a small thing. It was a number, and numbers talk. The remaining 8 species watched 4 of their coalition partners begin the process of pulling their vessels from formation, and several of them began quiet conversations of their own. Orath watched it all from the command deck, with the expression of a man watching a building develop a crack in its foundation. He showed Verk the withdrawal file that evening, or what passed for evening on a ship that kept arbitrary time cycles to maintain crew sanity. He set the data slate on the console between them without preamble and waited while Verk read. Verk read it twice. His face did not change much. It never did when he was genuinely thinking rather than performing authority. When he was performing, his expressions were large and deliberate. When he was actually processing something, he went very still and very quiet, and the only sign that anything was happening inside was a slight movement in his jaw muscles. "You're recommending full withdrawal," Verk said. "I'm presenting the tactical analysis. The recommendation at the end is where the math leads." "The math?" Verk set the slate down. "We have more than 3,000 ships still committed to this campaign." "Yes," Orath said, "and the outer ring structures have a projected engagement envelope that covers all of them simultaneously. We do not have a counter for the gravity shear system. We do not have a counter for whatever System 7 is. We do not know what Systems 1 through 6 are." He paused. "We knew what we were walking into when we planned this campaign, Grand Warlord. We knew the data. We assumed the data was complete. It was not." Verk looked at him for a long time. "If we leave without anything, we go home having shown 12 species and every watching power in the galaxy that one human ship can turn a coalition armada around." "Yes," Orath said, "that is what will have happened." A silence, not a comfortable one. "Then we cannot simply leave," Verk said. "We need something, a negotiated position, something that can be framed as a decision rather than a retreat." Orath had been waiting for this. "There may be a way," he said, "but you will not like the shape of it." Priya was in the weapons bay when Rian found her again. This time she was not running diagnostics. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the far wall, not reading anything, not moving anything. Just sitting with her thoughts, which from her expression were not particularly pleasant company. Rian sat across from her. He did not say anything immediately. He waited. "Do you know what System 7 does?" she said eventually. "No," Rian said. "You've never told me." She was quiet again. Then, "It disrupts the molecular cohesion of alloys, specifically the alloys used in spacecraft hull construction across a very large area. She folded her hands together. If we fired System 7 at the Coalition fleet right now, most of those ships would not be destroyed. They would not explode. They would simply come apart. The alloys would cease to be solid. The ships would lose structural integrity and the vacuum would do the rest. She paused. 4,000 ships. 4,000 crews. Rian said nothing. I designed it, she said. I designed it in a basement lab on Jupiter with 3 colleagues, and we were very proud of ourselves when it worked. We celebrated. I remember the celebration. She looked at her hands. I have thought about that celebration many times in the years since. It kept them away, Rian said. Whatever you built, it kept them away. No one has come at us directly because of what's on this ship. That's 20 years of no war. I know, she said. I know that. I know the argument. I made the argument myself many times to people who asked the same question you're not asking. She looked up. I just haven't figured out how to feel 2 things at once without both of them being real. Rian sat with that for a moment. Neither have I, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Verk's ultimatum arrived on the Resolute's open channel 2 hours later. He had broadcasted on every frequency simultaneously, which meant every ship in the fleet could hear it, which meant he was not making it as a private communication between commanders. He was making it as a political statement. Rian recognized the tactic. The ultimatum was aggressive. Verk threatened long-range kinetic bombardment of Earth's surface if the Resolute did not stand down and allow coalition vessels to proceed to orbit. He gave them 20 minutes. His voice carried the weight of someone who had decided, publicly and loudly, that he would rather risk everything than be seen backing down. Rian looked at Dara. Dara read the ultimatum in silence. Then she pulled up a schematic of Earth's current defensive coverage. The surface-to-orbit systems were fully online. The orbital platforms were charged. The outer ring could reach any vessel firing on Earth's surface within seconds of a targeting solution being confirmed. She set the schematic down. He's not wrong that he can fire, she said, and he's not wrong that it would hurt. She said it the way a doctor says a true thing that is hard to hear without softening it past accuracy. He's wrong about the ending. She opened the channel. Grand Warlord Verk, she said. We have listened to your ultimatum. Before we respond, I want to share something with you. She paused. We have been watching your coalition for 11 years. We understand your species, your technology, your tactics, and your political structure better than most of your own member species understand each other. We have had time to prepare. What you are looking at is not the best we have. It is the minimum we brought. Another pause. We built this ship so that we would never have to use it fully. We would prefer to keep it that way. Verk's channel was open. She could hear fleet noise in the background. Earth would like to offer the Coalition something in return for the withdrawal of this fleet. Agricultural and water reclamation technologies, freely shared, no conditions. We have been developing them for decades. They would benefit worlds in the outer Coalition systems that are currently experiencing resource shortfall. We have read those reports too. A very long pause on her end. Deliberate. We would rather give you something than take everything from you. That is our preference. It has always been our preference. We built all of this, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite sadness and not quite pride, hoping we would never need it. We still hope that. She closed the channel. The fleet went quiet. On every screen on the command deck, every sensor reading, every tactical display, the Coalition fleet held position and said nothing. Oreth, on the flagship, had already added the response to his withdrawal file. He had added one final line at the bottom of the document. He showed the file to Verk. Verk read it. He read it again. His hands on the console in front of him were very still. Outside, 4,700 ships said nothing. The silence stretched across the whole enormous dark, across every hull, every bridge, every crew compartment where beings of 12 different species were all, in their own ways, doing the same calculation. 19 minutes passed. Nobody fired. The message came through a tight beam signal, routed through the coalition fleet's most secure diplomatic channel, the kind used for communications that could not afford to be misunderstood and could not afford to be overheard. It was not Verk's voice. It was Orath, speaking on behalf of the Grand Warlord, which was itself a message inside the message. Verk could not say the words himself and preserve what remained of his public posture. So he sent his second, who was better with words anyway, and let him carry the weight of it. The message was 4 words. Terms accepted, withdrawing now. It was the shortest formal diplomatic communication in coalition history. Orath would later note in his private records that it was also the most accurate. It said precisely what was true and nothing else. On the Resolute, Rian read the words on the screen and sat back in his chair and pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes for a moment. He heard, around him, the sound of crew exhaling. Not cheering, not celebration, just the sound of air leaving lungs that had been half full for 71 hours. Dara read the message. She did not react visibly. She gave 3 quiet orders: stand down weapons systems, hold position until the fleet clears the outer marker, send the confirmation to Earth Command. Then she stepped back from the console and walked to the far side of the command deck, where the observation port gave a clean view of the space ahead. Rian watched her from across the deck and did not interrupt. The coalition fleet began its withdrawal in stages, the way any large force retreats when it is trying to look like it planned this. Organized, measured. The formation they maintained on the way out was clean, which took discipline, and the discipline itself communicated something. They were not running. They were leaving with their systems intact and their crews breathing and their ships in working order, and that was a better outcome than the alternative. Most of them knew it, even the ones who would never say so out loud. Orath watched them go from the flagship bridge. Ship by ship, then in groups, the vessels that had been sitting in Earth's approach corridor began their turnaround. Their FTL drives spooled up in sequence, and one by one they translated out of normal space, leaving behind the faint distortion signatures of faster-than-light departure. Each one was like a light going out in reverse, a brightness appearing for a moment and then expanding to nothing. He had watched 6 campaigns from this bridge. He had watched 6 different civilizations fail to push them back. He had never watched his own fleet leave. He was surprised to find it was not as shameful as he had imagined. There was something quieter in it. He searched for the right word. Honest, perhaps. It felt honest. They had arrived with a weight of assumptions that the humans had simply and methodically disproved, and now they were leaving with an accurate picture of the situation, which was more than could be said for most of the species they had absorbed over the centuries. Bish appeared beside him. Orath did not turn. "I will not say I told you so," Bish said. "I know," Orath said. "Thank you." "What do we tell the Council, the public, our worlds?" Orath was quiet for a moment. He thought about the right answer. Not the political answer, not the answer that would protect careers and smooth over uncomfortable truths, but the actual right answer, the one that would be most useful to his people in the long run. "We tell them what happened," he said. "We tell them we found a species that was prepared. We tell them about the ship. We tell them about the outer ring." He paused. "And we tell them what the humans offered us when they could have destroyed us. Because in 50 years, when someone is deciding whether to trade with Earth or study their technology or send an ambassador, that part will matter more than any of the rest." Bish looked at him for a moment. That is an unusual thing to say on the way home from a failed invasion. "Yes," Orath said, "I have had an unusual day." On the Resolute, the final coalition ship cleared the outer marker at just past the 73rd hour. Priya was still in the weapons bay. She had powered down each of the 17 systems in sequence, going through the shutdown procedures with the methodical care of someone who had turned them on the same way. Each system going dark felt like releasing a breath she had been holding. Not all at once. one breath at a time. When the last one went to standby, she sat for a while in the quiet. She thought about the design files still stored in the ship's secure core. She thought about the 22 years behind her. She thought about what she had said to Rian and what she had not said, and about the fact that both things were true simultaneously and would probably always be true. The pride and the horror were not fighting each other. They were the same feeling from different angles. A very human thing, to make something you hoped would never be used, and to be grateful when it wasn't, and to know that it existed and to not entirely know how to live with that knowledge, and to keep living with it anyway. She got up and went to the deck cafeteria and ate something for the first time in 36 hours. Rian found Dara at the observation port an hour after the last coalition ship had gone. He stood beside her and looked out at the space where 4,700 warships had been sitting and was now just space again, quiet and dark and full of stars. It was a remarkable amount of nothing to be left behind by that much something. "Did you ever doubt it?" he asked. He had asked her this before, in different words, in the early hours of the standoff. She had not answered then. He asked again because he genuinely wanted to know, and because he thought she might be ready to say it now, with the screens dark and the weapons down and no one watching except him. Dara was quiet for a long time. "Every second," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the stars. "The outer ring might not have worked," she said. "System 7 might have malfunctioned. They might have fired before we had a targeting solution. Verk might have been a different kind of man, one who chose destruction over the weight of looking wrong in front of his fleet." She paused. "I did not know. I knew the plan was good. I knew it was the best plan we had, but I did not know." "Then why didn't you show it?" he said. She turned to look at him. "Because they were watching." He understood that. He thought he had understood it before, but he understood it differently now, standing on the other side of it. In the weeks that followed, Earth's High Council processed the event in the way large institutions process extraordinary things, slowly, carefully, with many committees and many documents and a great deal of very controlled language. The official record was classified at the highest available level. The ISV Resolute's engagement log would not be declassified for 100 years. The Outer Ring's capabilities were not publicly confirmed. The Coalition transmission records were sealed. What could not be sealed was the word that spread. Faster-than-light communication carried rumors, second-hand accounts, the reports of species who had been watching from a distance on passive sensors. 17 star systems received some version of the story within the first month. Then more still. The accounts varied in their details. Some exaggerated the outer ring. Some missed the gravity shear demonstration entirely. Some focused on Admiral Dara's voice and the specific quality of her calm, which apparently translated across species and language barriers with startling clarity. But the core of it traveled accurately because the core of it was simple enough to survive retelling. A vast fleet had come to take a world. One ship had appeared. The fleet had turned around. The galaxy spent months trying to find a word for it. Several species worked on the problem independently, which was fitting, since the problem was a genuinely difficult one. Human behavior during the standoff did not fit neatly into any existing category of military conduct. It was not aggression. It was not submission. It was not negotiation in any form that matched the known frameworks. It was something else entirely, something that required a new category to hold. 3 civilizations, completely independently, arrived at the same translation. In the first language, it meant something like the ones who build the answer before the question arrives. In the second language, it was closer to those who make themselves into the thing the enemy cannot solve. But the third translation, from a species of slow-moving desert creatures who had never been to war in their recorded history, and had been watching the whole situation with intense academic interest from 11 light-years away, was the one that spread the furthest, because it was the shortest. They called humans the ones who waited. Not because the humans had been passive, not because they had done nothing, but because the waiting itself had been the weapon, the patience, the preparation, the choice. Made years before the fleet arrived, to be ready before being threatened, and the further choice, made in the moment of advantage, not to destroy when destroying was possible. A species that waited, prepared, and then offered food technology to the people who had come to conquer them. The galaxy filed this under a new category and spent a long time looking at it. On the Resolute, Dara cut the ship's running lights as it turned toward Earth. In the dark, it looked like any other piece of debris drifting through the solar system. A rock, a shadow, nothing of particular note, nothing worth worrying about. Until it moved. Slow and unhurried, engines at minimum thrust, it crossed the space between the outer debris field and Earth's orbital zone without a word on any channel. Below it, the blue planet turned in the light of its yellow sun, quiet as it had always been, full of people who had spent the last 3 days watching their screens with their hands folded and their hearts in their throats, waiting for news. The news arrived in 4 words from Earth Command. Resolute confirms, fleet gone. What followed, in living rooms and city squares and research stations and colonies across the solar system, was not a roar. It was something quieter than that. A sound that took a moment to build. The sound of people who had been afraid for a very long time and were now, slowly, letting themselves stop. Dara heard the crew around her on the command deck and did not join them. She looked at the planet below. She had been planning for this day for 15 years. She had never planned anything for the day after. She thought she might sleep. She thought Rian would probably want to talk, and that she would let him because he had earned it. She thought Priya deserved a formal commendation and would resist receiving one, and that she would give it to her anyway. She looked at Earth. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned from the observation port and went back to work. The ones who waited. Yes, that would do.